Thomas's life seemed perfect, a stable job, a beautiful home, and a wife he deeply loved. But sometimes what appears flawless is merely an illusion. He never imagined that the person he trusted the most would be the one to shatter that trust. Yet, once the seeds of doubt are planted, they only grow. And eventually, the truth reveals itself in a way that changes everything forever. Thomas woke early that morning, a little anxious, his mind flitting between the day ahead and the arrival of his wife, Amanda. She'd been gone for several weeks on business, and the house had felt empty without her. He'd made sure everything was just right. Coffee ready, the living room tidied, her favorite blanket draped over the armchair. The door opened, and there she was, standing in the morning light filtering through the hallway windows. Her smile was tired but warm, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "Welcome home, Amanda," he murmured. She hugged him tightly, resting her head on his shoulder. "It feels good to be back," her voice was soft. After a few moments, she stepped back and reached into her bag. She held something out to him, a small white stick. "I've got some news for you," she said, her face breaking into a soft smile. "I'm pregnant, Thomas." Thomas stared, processing the words and the object in her hand, a sense of surprise and excitement bubbling up in him. "Amanda, are you serious? This is... wow." He reached for her hand, holding it as he tried to take it in. Amanda nodded, laughing as she brushed a tear from her eye. "Yes." "We're going to be parents, Tom. Isn't that worth celebrating?" She gave him a quick kiss and squeezed his hand. Though happiness filled him, a sliver of doubt crept in. They hadn't been close lately, not since before her trip, and he hesitated, mentioning it in a quiet voice. But Amanda simply laughed it off, saying something about how timing could be strange and that she'd schedule an appointment with her doctor to confirm everything. Thomas nodded, feeling reassured but still oddly unsettled, as he grabbed his coat and briefcase for work. All the way to the office, her news weighed on his mind, that hint of doubt lingering despite her easy explanations. Thomas settled into his office, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. He could hardly focus on the contracts on his desk or the emails piling up in his inbox. Instead, his thoughts drifted back, replaying the story of how he'd met Amanda, how she had changed his life. It had been 5 years ago at a celebration thrown by the company for his promotion to senior manager. He remembered the excitement that night, the crowded room, the chatter of colleagues, and how proud he'd felt. Then he'd spotted Amanda across the room, laughing and talking to his colleague, Jason Palmer. Jason, a man as ambitious as Thomas, was known for his arrogance and was always quick to take credit, sometimes even for work he hadn't done. Their competitive relationship had its moments, and while they respected each other's talent, there was always a simmering rivalry. That night, Jason's attitude was as bold as ever. He was laughing too loudly, holding on to Amanda's arm as if she were a prize. Thomas noticed the way he leaned in, seeming to stake his claim. Jason had a way of turning every moment into a contest, and Thomas wasn't one to back down easily. He struck up a conversation with Amanda, and before long they were talking easily, laughing about little things, while Jason stood there looking impatient and irritated. Amanda was smart, easy to talk to, and charming without trying too hard, something he found himself drawn to instantly. As the evening wore on, Jason grew more arrogant, throwing out hints about his own ambitions, and even bragging about future plans he barely seemed to believe himself. Thomas watched Amanda's expression shift, her interest waning as Jason's bragging became tiresome. When Jason finally excused himself to speak with a group of executives, Thomas offered to get her a drink, and she smiled, looking relieved. From there, things just clicked. They exchanged numbers, and soon a coffee date turned into dinners. They laughed through late-night conversations, spent weekends exploring the city, and shared quiet evenings at Thomas's apartment. Thomas had never felt so connected to someone before. Amanda was thoughtful, kind, and she made him feel seen, like he was finally home. A year into dating, Thomas knew he couldn't wait any longer. One evening they were walking along the beach, the moonlight casting a soft glow on the water. He turned to her. The words felt simple and right. He took her hand, looked into her eyes, and asked her to marry him. She said yes, with a smile that lit up her whole face. After they were married, Thomas bought them a house near the ocean. It was small but comfortable, and they spent hours fixing it up together, arranging furniture, choosing paint colors, and turning it into a place they both loved. Some days they would sit on the back porch, watching the waves roll in and talking about everything from their hopes to their worries. They built their life with love and laughter, and though there were small arguments over chores, late nights at work, and even the way they rearranged the kitchen, they always found their way back to each other. Thomas thought about all those moments, the happy ones, and even the rough ones. He could see Amanda's smile, hear her laugh, and feel her hand in his. And now, with the news of the baby, he wondered if they were about to start a whole new chapter. But that one nagging question kept coming back. Is his wife honest with him? Because some of the puzzles about her pregnancy weren't adding up. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. Thomas tried to brush the nagging doubts from his mind. He loved Amanda, and he wanted to believe her. By the time he arrived home that evening, he had managed to push most of those thoughts aside, deciding that trust was more important. When he opened the door, he was greeted by soft candlelight and the smell of Amanda's cooking. She had prepared a romantic dinner, wine for him, sparkling water for her, and all their favorite dishes. They laughed together, shared stories about their days, and everything felt almost normal. Amanda seemed happier than ever, glowing with excitement. She spoke tenderly, her voice full of love, and Thomas felt himself relax. After dinner, Amanda took his hand, giving him a hinting smile as she suggested they head upstairs. When he hesitated, mentioning the pregnancy, she assured him with a warm laugh. "Oh, Thomas," she said, "I checked with the doctor already. He said it's safe for us." They went to bed that night, and Thomas tried his best to put his doubts away. But 2 days later, Amanda returned from a doctor's appointment with a detail that hit him hard. "Thomas, the doctor said I'm about 4 weeks along," she told him, smiling as she shared the news. Thomas did a quick calculation in his head and felt his stomach twist.
He was certain they hadn't been intimate 4 weeks ago. When he cautiously brought it up, Amanda brushed it off, insisting it had happened and that he had just forgotten. Her explanation was smooth, almost rehearsed. Thomas nodded along, pretending to agree. But inside, his mind raced with suspicion. Days passed, and the doubts grew stronger, weighing on him constantly. Then something else happened that made his heart sink. Thomas began to feel an uncomfortable irritation in his groin, something that only got worse. Worried, he decided to see a doctor without telling Amanda. He took a few tests, hoping it was nothing serious, but the results came back with a shock he hadn't expected. He had contracted an STD. The news hit him like a hammer, bringing everything he'd been trying to ignore into sharp, painful focus. In that moment, his doubts became something stronger. The discovery gnawed at Thomas, and he knew he couldn't ignore his suspicions any longer. He needed answers. Amanda was out for the morning, so he took a chance to check her things. He opened her laptop, digging carefully through her emails and any documents he could find related to her recent trip. Thomas knew Amanda worked with a different company now, but he didn't expect what he was about to find. After scrolling through countless emails and scanned documents, he found an itinerary for her business trip. As he scanned the list of participants, his stomach dropped. There, among the names, was one he hadn't seen in a long time: Jason Palmer. He hadn't even known Jason was still in the same field. Jason had left Thomas's company over a year ago, and Thomas hadn't thought about him since. But here was Jason's name alongside Amanda's as part of the team for the business exhibition. Jason. Jason wasn't just attending the same event. He was a colleague now. It all came rushing back. The rivalry, the arrogance, the way Jason had hovered over Amanda at that party years ago. It was impossible to shake the feeling that Jason might have seen this as his chance to get back at him. After all, it had been no secret back then that Amanda's interest had shifted toward Thomas, and Jason had never taken that loss lightly. Could Jason be using this new connection with Amanda to settle an old score? Or worse, had they rekindled something in his absence? As these thoughts circled in his mind, the pieces started clicking into place in a way that Thomas couldn't ignore. He couldn't prove it yet, but it was starting to feel like he was staring at a clear picture of betrayal. The thought that Amanda might have fallen in love with Jason and was now scheming behind his back haunted Thomas. He couldn't shake the image of her and Jason whispering in each other's ears, mocking him, plotting to take everything he'd worked for. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the thought of Amanda making him look like a fool. If she had a child with Jason and passed it off as his, she could secure alimony and possibly take a large share of his assets. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't just stand by. He needed to protect himself before it was too late. Thomas acted quickly. Within days, he met with a lawyer and a financial advisor. He explained everything: Amanda's suspicious behavior, her possible connection with Jason, and the pregnancy. The lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Ellen, didn't waste time. She outlined a strategy that would protect his finances and his property. Together, they developed a plan. First, Ellen suggested that Thomas create a new trust fund. This trust would own his most valuable assets: the house, his retirement fund, and his stock portfolio. Legally, the trust would hold these assets for the benefit of future heirs or specific family members, meaning Amanda couldn't claim them in a divorce settlement. Since Thomas would only be a trustee and not the owner of the assets, they would be out of Amanda's reach. Next, his financial advisor recommended transferring his savings to offshore accounts in countries with strict privacy laws. By placing his money in international accounts, they could protect it from legal claims. The advisor also suggested Thomas convert a portion of his savings into physical assets like gold and collectibles, which could be stored in private vaults. These assets wouldn't be tied to his name on paper, making them harder to trace. They also agreed that Thomas should take out a loan against the house. The loan funds would be placed in a secured account under his lawyer's firm, with the debt technically lowering the house's value. If Amanda tried to claim the house, the value would be reduced by the loan balance, making it less attractive in the settlement. Finally, Ellen advised Thomas to keep detailed records of everything: his interactions with Amanda, her strange behavior, and any evidence he could gather regarding Jason. If this ever went to court, Thomas would need proof of Amanda's deception. Over the next week, Thomas quietly put these plans into motion. He moved his savings, transferred the house to the trust, and began securing his assets piece by piece. He was careful not to raise any suspicion, keeping his conversations with Amanda light and acting as if nothing had changed. Thomas knew he couldn't stop there. He needed solid proof. So he hired a private detective to track Amanda's movements and confirm his suspicions about Jason. The detective, a quiet and thorough man named David, got to work right away. Amanda and Jason were clever, though. They hid their relationship carefully, never acting openly romantic or spending too much time together in public. Still, David managed to capture a few moments: a lingering look, a private lunch, and an evening in a small, secluded cafe. In some photos and videos, Amanda and Jason leaned in close, speaking softly with an unmistakable warmth in their expressions. It wasn't much, but it was probably good enough for court. Their meetings looked less like colleagues discussing work and more like two people sharing something deeper. Thomas didn't give David much time to gather more. He felt ready. He couldn't wait any longer. With everything in place, Thomas met with his lawyer, Ellen, and together they finalized the divorce papers. Ellen made sure the paperwork covered everything, protecting his assets as they had planned, leaving Amanda with far less than she might have expected. Once the papers were ready, Thomas quietly packed his essentials, leaving behind the life he had built with Amanda. Without a word, Thomas left town, moving to another part of the country where Amanda couldn't reach him easily. He stayed in a quiet hotel, letting the days pass in silence. He waited, knowing she would. Eventually, she returned home to an empty house. When Amanda came back from her 3-day trip, she found the house empty and quiet. At first, she assumed Thomas was working late or out with friends, but then she saw the envelope on the kitchen counter. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were the divorce papers, stamped and signed, and nothing else. She stood there staring in shock, unable to understand how everything had fallen apart so suddenly. Amanda tried everything to reach Thomas. She called his old number, which was now disconnected. She searched for him on social media, but his accounts had vanished. She even tried mutual friends, but no one knew where he was. It was as if Thomas had disappeared overnight, leaving her with nothing but the cold reality of the divorce papers. Meanwhile, Thomas was struggling. Sitting alone in his hotel room, the weight of everything he'd gone through sank in deeply. The betrayal, the broken trust, and the doubts he'd pushed down for so long were now impossible to ignore. The stress, the long nights of thinking, and the loneliness felt like they were eating away at him. He decided he needed a break from everything. Somewhere quiet, somewhere he could clear his mind. After some searching, Thomas found a cabin in the woods. It was small, but he didn't need much. He quit his job, finding the office and the memories of Amanda and Jason's betrayal unbearable. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by trees and open sky, a perfect place to be alone with his thoughts. Here, he hoped he could find some peace. When the divorce trial began, Thomas didn't even show up in person. He stayed in touch through video if the judge required it, but mostly his lawyer, Ellen, handled everything. Amanda, however, had no idea what she was walking into. She arrived at the court unprepared, expecting things to go her way. But Thomas had planned carefully. The trust fund, the offshore accounts, the reduced house value, none of it was accessible to Amanda. She had been left with nothing but the divorce papers and her frustration. Amanda was furious, but her options were few. The only card she could play was her pregnancy. She tried to use it as leverage, thinking it would win her sympathy, but Thomas had come prepared with his own evidence. Ellen presented his medical records, showing he had contracted an STD, a fact Amanda could hardly dispute. Along with this, the photos and videos of her with Jason were shown as evidence of infidelity. In a matter of minutes, Amanda's advantage had disappeared, and she found herself cornered. She had come to the courtroom expecting control, but she left with nothing. There was nothing she could do to reverse it. The life she had imagined, the plan she had counted on, was slipping out of reach. And in that moment, she realized that the man she had tried to fool had left her with nothing but a sense of loss. After everything fell apart, Amanda went to meet Jason. She was desperate and hoped he would give her some comfort, but as soon as she arrived, she saw the anger in his eyes. Jason didn't hold back.
"You ruined everything," he hissed, glaring at her. "I thought you'd have enough sense to keep quiet about the pregnancy until we had everything sorted. But no, you rushed into it, and now Thomas has shut us out completely." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. She had thought she and Jason were in love, that they were partners in this. But now, seeing the harshness on his face, she felt a new, creeping doubt. Jason didn't look at her with love or care. His face was twisted in frustration, like someone who had just lost a game he thought he had won. "I thought," she stammered, searching for words. "I thought we were in this together. I thought we were doing this because we cared about each other." Jason scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You were supposed to help me take Thomas down," he snapped, "but you told him about the baby too soon. We could have checked everything first, lined up the paperwork, secured the assets. But no, now he's moved everything, and it's all gone." Amanda felt a mix of shame and fear. She'd been so sure Jason cared for her, but now she could see that all he wanted was revenge on Thomas. She was just a pawn in his plan. As she opened her mouth to say something, Jason cut her off. "You know what?" he said, his voice cold. "I don't want anything to do with you anymore. You ruined this whole thing." Amanda felt tears prick her eyes. "But the baby?" she said quietly, hoping he'd show some sign of sympathy, some hint of care. Jason just laughed bitterly and shook his head. "What baby?" he said, waving her off with an annoyed look. Who knows who you've been with? Don't pin that on me. He turned and walked away, leaving Amanda alone. She stood there, stunned, realizing she'd lost everything. Thomas, the life they'd built, and now even the man she thought she could rely on. 2 years later. 2 years had passed since Thomas left. Amanda had given birth to a baby boy and somehow managed to keep her life together, thanks to the help of her family. Her parents and siblings supported her, giving her strength when things felt overwhelming. But despite all the help, she often felt hollow. She had tried to start fresh and even thought about dating again, but every attempt seemed to fall apart before it began. Men didn't stick around, and even Jason had vanished completely from her life. Her days felt lonely, and her nights were often worse. Memories of her mistakes haunted her, filling her with regret. She spent hours thinking about Thomas, wondering how he was, how things could have been different if she hadn't made those choices. Guilt gnawed at her constantly, and the weight of her conscience was almost unbearable. Meanwhile, Thomas had started a new life, far from the shadows of his past. To find peace, he had turned to nature, going solo camping and climbing in the mountains, capturing his adventures on video. He started a blog, sharing his journeys with an online community. His new hobby brought him calm and fulfillment, and his videos quickly gained a following, providing a steady income. He even got a dog, a loyal companion that went everywhere with him. A friend he knew would never betray him. One evening, Thomas was rereading comments under one of his recent videos. As he scrolled, one comment caught his eye. It was from a woman, and her words made him stop. "Thomas, I recognized you. I apologize for everything that happened. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Sorry for writing here. I have no other way to reach you. Just know that I regret it deeply." Thomas didn't need a name to know who it was. Amanda must have stumbled upon his blog, perhaps by accident or by searching for him. Her words filled him with a strange mix of nostalgia and relief. The pain she'd caused still lingered, but he no longer felt anger. He had moved on, finding peace in his new life. After a moment, he replied to her comment. "I do not hold a grudge. God will judge us. Live happily." He hit send and closed the laptop, feeling a sense of closure. He had made peace with his past, and now he could move forward, free from bitterness, with only hope for the future.